Hello, 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 everyone. We are back. Ooh, webcam's a little. There we go. Nice and nice and level there. We're back. Sorry for the unexplained absence last week. A bit of a medical issue in my life. I'm not going to go too much into detail with it, just because, well, it'll make too many people happy, I suppose. But we're back. I'm all better now. Still have some tea. I'm gonna dial back on the black teas since that contributed a bit to what I was experiencing. So we have green tea today, which is nice. It's very smooth tea and cooler, so I can probably drink some of it now. And in light of the fact that I've had a, that medicine has been on my mind, and the fact that I did in fact reach out to debunk the funk with Dr. Wilson to see if he'd be interested in coming on. No response yet, but I also only recently emailed him, so uh, I don't expect to hear back immediately. But seeing as though that's all been on my mind, I figured I'd follow up. I was fully expecting to not have so many instances where we were talking about vaccines and COVID and stuff. But again, thinking about medical stuff, and it was a requested thing, and the person who from the same person who requested I watch the Neil deGrasse Tyson and Del Bigtree debate. I figure you know what? Let's see what RFK Jr. has to say on Joe Rogan. Now, a couple of things about that. One, I'm a little unsure as to how like DMCA and stuff. I know with especially with bigger things like Joe Rogan's podcast and is it even a podcast? His program anyway. There's a lot more uncertainty there, so I'm a little hesitant to watch the original as opposed to a video of someone talking about it. But additionally, I want to I want to like do something a little bit different. See, previously when we were watching this stuff, we were leaving it to our own devices. We were trusting ourselves to sort through what, Del Bigtree and Neil deGrasse Tyson were saying, figure out who's telling the truth, and it was a lot of peripheral processing, if I'm remembering the phrase correctly. Basically estimating, but not being able to fully engage because we're not experts, right? And that's okay. Not everyone's an expert on everything. In fact, it's necessary and important that people are specialized. It should be expected. That said, um, it does mean that we're more bound to make mistakes. There are things I'm certain to have missed in that debate, and certain things I'm definitely going to miss talking about watching RFK Jr. and Joe Rogan. The reason I'm more concerned there is that Joe Rogan, while he does have a tendency to push back a little bit on what his guests are talking about, he is not particularly well known for being hey Galit, for being the most combative. I don't even know if combative is the right word, but he's not necessarily going to challenge them in all the ways he needs to. He often falls into the same kind of like, oh wow, that's interesting, like that the people he's bringing on are trying to engender in their audiences. He'll like this, I mean he was an ivermectin guy, right? Like he falls for all sorts of stuff. Like every whack diet or whatever comes on his show, he's like, "Oh, that's interesting." He doesn't often push back on these wild medical claims. Additionally, he's not an expert himself. Even with Neil deGrasse Tyson, he wasn't an expert, but he had some knowledge and he could try to push back before he realized where he was and kind of checked out. So what I want to do is look at another way of doing this, which I mean, I'm sure most people do anyway. That's why we have content creators to talk about this kind of thing. But I want to see, I don't want to come off like I know everything about this stuff, and so I want to show you that, like, I'm also looking to other people and to trust what they're saying about this. And for what it's worth, I have seen from what we saw previously from that channel, Debunk the Funk with Dr. Wilson. I do like the name. I will say, he seems rather trustworthy, and he's going to be able to, I hope, catch things that I'm not going to. That said, I'm not just going to watch the video without commentary or anything like that. Just be like, oh well, he'll get it. There's going to be stuff that we can always contribute, and that's something I hope. This is, I guess, kind of my views on doing philosophy popping up again. That you can hear the opinions of others and the positions of others, and even trust that people know more than you about stuff, but still contribute meaningfully with your own thoughts and stuff. So also with the idea of like I don't really want to go for like 3 hours today. Maybe tomorrow we'll do like a full debate review. I actually have one in the wings that I want to watch. I think the idea today is I think I just want to go over this video that happens to be my one of my recommended videos just because we've been watching this stuff, which is should be like a decent confluence of what I was asked to review and also the information I want to get on the subject. So we'll try to watch this video. We'll watch this. We'll watch the Joe Rogan interview with RFK Jr. through the lens of debunk the funk with Dr. Wilson. And I do
Since the
want
start,
to, I do want to, I do want to highlight that is the method by the way in which I'm approaching it. It's through the lens of this analyst. Now that doesn't necessarily mean again that we're gonna agree with everything. I probably don't know enough to disagree with much. Oh, by the way, chat, let me know. I messed with some of my settings. I didn't want the chat to be so bold on the screen, so I dialed down the opacity of the chat on the top right here. Let me know if it's like coming through okay. If you can read it fine still. If it looks all right. I can put it back up or mess with the settings. Make it more or less opaque. But I didn't want it just this block of white on the side there. So let me know. Let me know what you think about that. So we're gonna be watching this video now. Obviously, the full interview. Let me see. Let me see if we can find the full thing. Um, the full video. Um, oh well, I guess it's not here, but I'm guessing the full video is much longer, right? The Joe Rogan's Joe Rogan show. What is it called? The Joe Rogan Experience is usually is usually quite long, right? It's like a podcast, right? It's supposed to be like an hour and a half or whatever else. Uh, we're not going to get the full thing here, but I also don't want the full thing. Oftentimes these have like a lot of fluff and a lot of stuff that is maybe not intentionally, but intended to set a tone, which is fine, right? Like tone setting is kind of important with these kinds of things. It's Joe Rogan has a very relaxed interviewing style, and he wants to make both his guest and the audience a little relaxed and how they're approaching stuff. And there's going to be a lot of extra stuff that's not necessarily going to be on the subject that we want to address, right? We might even get to subjects that are completely unrelated to particularly vaccines, which is what we wanted to look over. So if we find, I'll put it this way, if we find that viewing the interview through this lens is causes any problems for whatever reason, and feel free in chat to like let me know if there are issues you find with doing it in this way. Maybe we'll go back and we'll like watch the full podcast, or maybe I'll watch it on my own and then come back with what I think about it. I'm just worried that without basically a reliable voice of reason in the conversation, that a lot of information is going to go unchallenged in a way that I'm not even necessarily going to catch because I'm not an expert on this stuff. And I know that at the very least that we're going to get a lot of discussions of things that are more scientifically technical in a way that I'm not an expert in. So we're going to view it through this lens, and we'll see how that goes. All right. So I was going to say Mr. Wilson, but no, Dr. Wilson. Let's get into it.
since the start of the COVID pandemic, an absolute tsunami of anti-vaccine misinformation has swept the internet, and Joe Rogan
And of
was
course, I haven't seen this
definitely
yet.
swept away by it. Even though Joe Rogan has had both reasonable scientists and people who have no idea what they're talking about on his show, he seems
Constantly, just absolutely constantly, by the way. And it's one of those like you can't trust that just because someone's there they know what they're talking about. I mean, he's had people on there. He's had Jordan Peterson on there talking about literally anything. Is that enough? I feel like that's enough.
to have been completely enamored with the ones who have no idea what they're talking about,
Yeah.
including people like Robert Malone and Brett Weinstein, whose conversations with Rogan I've previously debunked on this channel. But now we've reached a new level with Joe Rogan platforming the biggest anti-vaxxer in the past few decades.
Okay, so I was waiting for what I was sure we were going to get to, which is the context, right? Who is Robert F. Kennedy Jr.? So I don't know tons about this guy. I know he is running for president, as I understand, uh, in the Democratic Party, which, as I understand, is also a little bit weird. So let's do a little looking into him. So RFK Jr. is the son of Robert F. Kennedy, obviously, who was assassinated shortly after his brother, if I remember correctly, in the 1960s. Maybe it was the 70s. I don't remember exactly. But RFK was also RFK Senior, not Junior, was also a pretty well-known political figure and was pretty like as from what I've seen, better regarded even than his brother. But obviously, this is not RFK Senior. This is RFK Junior. Uh, he is, as I say, well, okay. So that even Wikipedia is saying he is like the anti-vaccine propaganda is it within the first sentence. It makes it pretty clear that this is a big thing of his. I've seen him been popping up on Twitter recently in ways that are kind of funny. Not that he did, just like someone took a picture, like saw a picture of him without his shirt, and he's apparently very fit, and so they were like, "Oh, I'll vote for this guy over I think it was Chris Christie any day." And it was like so weird of like why are your political opinions being formed based on how someone looks? And there's nothing against RFK there. He's fit. Good for him. Like there was nothing bad. Just kind of weird the ways he comes up. Um yeah, so yeah, so son of the U.S. Attorney General and Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and nephew of U.S. President JFK. Yeah, yeah. So I don't want to like go through the whole thing. I do. Okay, yeah. There's a lot of like clinics and medical stuff. Seems like the health thing is big in his life. Political views. That's what I want to get to. Kennedy's writer often utilizes conspiracy theories that I didn't know. He expressed skepticism about the COVID-19 pandemic, contending that it served to benefit billionaires. That is a big red flag for me. It's one thing for someone to be anti-vaccine. I already have issues with that. But the conspiracy that COVID vaccine was like invented to help billionaires or whatever else, this signals some like pretty severe brain worms. According to Kennedy, the pandemic resulted in $4.4 trillion shift in wealth from the American middle class. Yeah, this is because this. Okay, this isn't a conspiracy. That's because that's how the world works. That's bad, and we should do something about that. That's why I'm a socialist. But this isn't like, oh, they invented a pandemic so this can happen. This was just the pandemic, like everything else, was leveraged by the wealthy to make themselves more wealthy. The problem isn't like that doesn't mean the pandemic was invented. It's a problem of capitalism. Is this guy anti-capitalist? I don't know. We'll find out. But if he's not, it makes you wonder, you know. Uh, yeah, the American government is dominant by corporate power. That's pretty accurate, but I get at least to my mind, I'm wondering if this is in the conspiracy section, what exactly he means by that, or if Wikipedia maybe disagrees for some reason. He's accused the Environmental Protection Agency of being run by the oil, coal, and the pesticide industry. I don't know about run by, but they have a lot of influence. It's weird. Maybe this is maybe this isn't. No, this is. Oh, okay. This isn't conspiracy stuff. I don't know. Uh, okay. A lot of these views actually, I do. It does make sense to me that he's running Democrat. Is my understanding. Yeah, like a lot of these are less right wing views for sure. I don't know if he goes like full socialist or anything like that. We can take a look here. I'm trying to find if there's any like very specifically like, hey, is he a socialist or is he just like a Democrat, right? Like left leaning capitalist, which is still better than a right leaning capitalist. Don't get me wrong. I just want to understand where he stands. It's not super relevant. I'm just curious. Um, I mean, he's opposed to the Koch brothers. Who can be mad about that? I mean, a lot of people. Um, so it seems like his political views are like a lot of which I tend to like either agree with or seem very reasonable to me. So I guess we're gonna mostly disagree on the vaccine stuff and the health stuff. Okay. Good to know. And as I understand, as I say, he is running for president. I don't anticipate that he's going to have much of a go of it. Um, Candidates like this show up a lot, where like if you're too much about one issue, your run is mostly about existing for that issue. Maybe in the future he might have more political relevance, but also like there's an incumbent president. It's not like he's gonna. I don't know if he's gonna primary Joe Biden, but if he did, I think that would actually be pretty bad, given his political views that we've seen. I think even he would have to acknowledge it would be pretty bad politically for him to primary Joe Biden. The reason being is just due to political inertia, he's unlikely to win a primary. It's an incumbent president. It's just not gonna go particularly. It's an incumbent president that's at least popular enough. Nobody really knows who RFK Jr. is. There's a bunch of stuff working against him. Even if he would be a better president, and I'm not sure that he would or wouldn't. The problem is now you're in a sense like by fighting this prior fight, you're weakening Biden against the Republican nominee, and the Republicans are looking to nominate either Trump or DeSantis. So like it's pretty important that those people not win. It sucks that means like it's better for him not to run. Like even what like sucks for his position, sucks if he is actually a better candidate than Biden, which I'm not sure that he is. By the way, the whole conspiracy shit is worrying, and we'll see what he says on Joe Rogan. But uh, if an incumbent president is running and you're in the same party, I'm sorry, like politically, it's usually a better idea to just not run or wait for the next one. I'm not actually, I'm not sure. Oh yeah, so yeah, he is. Looks like he is running. He's Kennedy 24, and politically, I just think that's a bad idea. I'm not saying like it's morally wrong. I just think it's politically bad, you know. But if you want to take a look, here's his. Maybe we'll come back to here. But it's a little off topic for what we're talking about, and we're going to let Dr. Wilson do a little bit more context. I just wanted to look at political context, which it seemed unlikely to come from a video that's more talking about his medical views.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another
Oh, I
F.
thought he was
Kennedy
going to go
Jr.
through what's here. I'm not. Oh, this is from the Center of Countering Digital Hate. Oh, that's worrying that he's on here. Um, this is a long-standing anti-vaxxer, and his Children's Health Defense hosts a range of anti-vaccine articles. So as I understand, okay, we're gonna look into the extent of the anti-vax stuff, because if it's one thing to be anti-COVID vaccine, I think it is in a different league entirely to be anti-vaccine in general, which we'll get to more of, but I think I've discussed previously as well. Kennedy's account was banned from Instagram on 8th of February, yet his Facebook page remains active. Sure. Okay, this is okay. So let's go back to his Wikipedia and see if there's anything about okay, vaccine advocacy. Yeah, okay, yeah, it's already immediate. Like anti-advocacy joined in 2015. Okay, yeah, so he's like full anti-vax. This is again a problem is as is better laid out in the H bomber guy video I talked about the last time we were on the subject. I will recommend it to you again. It is in the description of that previous video. You can just also search H bomber guy vaccines and autism. Um, if someone is in this camp, in the like Andrew Wakefield camp, and like this is more extreme than Andrew Wakefield, I'll be honest, their brain doesn't work right. Like there's just no other like they're either incredibly dishonest, happy to lie to everyone about everything, or their brain doesn't work right, because the evidence just isn't there. And on top of everything, you have to remember that like autism is an okay thing to have. It's not. It's not like to say I'd rather risk dying to measles than risk getting autism is pretty fucked up. And I'm gonna keep hammering that nail until every time this comes up, because this is I think this is under discussed. Being autistic is okay. Dying from a disease is not. Not to mention like, oh my god, campaigned against the fluoridation of drinking water. By the way, has improved dental health in as far as I understand. Fluoride in the water has improved the general dental health of the population, because fluoride is good for your teeth, and just that little bit isn't doing anything else. But okay, so like full anti-vaccine nut job. Okay, cool. That's the kind of information I wanted to hear.
Hey, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another debunking video. Obviously, here I'm going to be going through.
Oh, and I will admit I don't know the distinctions here of like is molecular biology. I assume molecular biology would be the field that you would want a PhD in if you were going into like vaccines and stuff. So I assume that that's the right field, but I don't know enough to know otherwise.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s discussion with Joe Rogan, covering the relevant anti vaccine or COVID claims that he made during that conversation, and explaining exactly why they are just wrong. I'll be doing that with peer reviewed scientific literature and publicly available data.
Cool. So this is where now we're back to what we were talking about when we saw Neil deGrasse Tyson talk to Del Bigtree. We're talking about scientifically verifiable information that is scientific consensus, which doesn't mean like a bunch of scientists just happen to agree and they have the same opinion. It means that's the direction the data is pointing. Notice that this is the direction of debunks from people people who are well not conspiracy theorists, I guess. Whereas RFK types will point to well this one study that's been debunked by a crank who's shilling his book, you know. And that's not like a combination of like different people. That's this guy specifically. By the way, okay, never mind. Discredited former Doctor Andrew Wakefield. Very specifically, all those things apply to. He is literally a, literally all those things as I just said. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, like, and by the way, oh yeah, incorrectly hypothesized the MMR vaccine causes autism. When this says incorrectly hypothesized, this cause a causal link, we it's he hypothesized that in the conclusion of his paper and nowhere else. Um, or no, sorry, that's not true. His paper was about the hypothesis. He couldn't prove it. It was the disease. It was what was it? Gastroenterocolitis was like the disease he made up in the conclusion. Excuse me. I'm trying to remember what I saw in that video I've been recommending. Again, watch it yourself. Uh, so sometimes I'll forget. All right, let's get back to it.
All of which I'm linking in the description below so that you can read them for yourself and not just take my word for it. You will find that all of the anti vaccine claims that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. makes in his conversation with Rogan have been tirelessly debunked over and over again for many years. But as misinformation recycles itself, scientists and scientific communicators do have a responsibility to address it each time.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as people keep popping up with it, it becomes relevant to debug. Even though it's tiresome to keep having to come back to this.
That's what I'm going to do
yeah.
here. And with all that said,
Grateful for the people who do it.
Let's start at the beginning of this episode with Robert's claims about mercury.
And they kept saying to me, well, I can't answer that detailed question. You need to talk to Paul Offit.
So here he's talking about Dr. Paul Offit, a
Not
very
exactly
well-respected doctor who is responsible for creating the current rotavirus vaccine, a vaccine that is responsible for saving hundreds of thousands of children's lives. I talked to Paul and asked him if he remembers his conversation with Kennedy. He says he does. So I'll be using that as we talk about what Kennedy said about that conversation.
So I don't know very much about this. Hopefully we'll get more context given in, but and I hope he's not relying on us to already know what happened in this conversation. That was, by the way, the first I'd ever heard what RFK Jr. sounded like. It was kind of interesting moment of like, oh yeah, I've heard discussion of this guy a lot, and I think that's the first time I've ever heard his voice.
And when I talked to him, I caught him in a lie.
What was the lie?
Well, I asked him this question. I said, why is it at CDC and every state regulator recommends that pregnant women do not eat tuna fish to avoid the mercury, but that CDC is recommending mercury-containing flu shots with huge bolus doses of mercury. I mean, massive doses.
This is exactly what I mean. Oh man, this claim is exactly why I'm glad we're watching a debunk from someone who knows better. As just a layperson, I don't know what the difference is between the mercury containing these. I have heard other sources talk about like this is a false equivalency, but I wouldn't know enough to know how to approach this issue, and this sounds super reasonable, but we're literally about to get to why that makes no sense. I'm sure.
That pregnant women in every trimester of pregnancy. And he said, well, Bobby, there's two kinds of mercury. There's a good mercury and there's a bad mercury. That his argument was not with me, but it was with the periodic tables.
That doesn't sound like anything a scientist would say. I mean, if they actually said that, that'd be ridiculous. But I really doubt it. I also wouldn't be surprised if there were different. Well, maybe putting it in that way because he doesn't think RFK would understand any differently. I don't know, because there are different kinds of the same element. We often classify them the same, like isotopes and oh, I forget the other terms. Like if an element has an extra neutron, or one less neutron, it sometimes functions very differently in how it interacts, or like it's missing an electron for some reason. I don't know how all of this goes, but there could be differences like that, and you'd have to be kind of an expert. But the way he's talking about it, like, oh, that's ridiculous. But what? Why is that ridiculous? Like,
Because there's no such thing as a good mercury.
But his debunk is there's no such thing as a good mercury. Oh, okay. Well, that sounds really reasonable. But chemically speaking, is that correct? Let's find out.
Talked to Paul Offit about this. He told me that he explained the science to Kennedy.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
not a lie.
That makes more sense.
Kennedy just doesn't understand basic chemistry. Mercury as an element is not the same in every single chemical context. What do I mean by this? Well, take the element chlorine, for example. If you were to
a
drink
pretty good example.
elemental chlorine, your stomach would convert it to hydrochloric acid, and it would eat your stomach from the inside out, and you would die.
It's a very
Why
horrible death. If I'm not mistaken, that's what like the chlorine gas used in, particularly in World Wars One and Two, would do to someone. And as I understand, it was a horrific death. Also, allegedly, Assad uses it against his own people. Allegedly.
Then is it okay to eat table salt, sodium chloride? Chemical context. Chlorine's properties are completely different depending on the chemical context.
Yeah, that makes
It's
sense.
the same with mercury. In nature, the
And yeah, it makes you wonder, right? Like that makes sense, even at like a middle schooler's understanding, which I would expect like a middle schooler or high schooler to understand exactly what Dr. Wilson just said. It makes you wonder why RFK is acting like that's nonsense.
the mercury that we find naturally in the crust of the earth and in fish is methylmercury. Methylmercury has very different properties than the mercury compound that is associated with vaccines, which is ethylmercury. Methylmercury is able to pass through the cell's membrane, and it is harder to metabolize, giving it a much longer half-life, meaning that methylmercury can accumulate in your body much more easily and cause damage. Ethylmercury doesn't have that problem. Not only can it not pass the cell membrane, but it has a much shorter half-life. Those are just the basic chemical differences that Kennedy completely misses in pretty much every single one of his interviews about mercury and vaccines.
And one of the things that I like to, as you've, anyone who's been watching me for any significant time will know that I like to do is wonder, right? Like, understand that this isn't just a claim that exists in the ether. A person made this claim. A person who should, especially given his advocacy and like how much he makes it a part of his life, should have encountered this information before, should be able to understand it. I mean, I understood it, and I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm a layperson. I'm not an expert in any regard. I'm not an advocate in the way that RFK Jr. is. Like, but he said it anyway, right? He acts like it's ridiculous anyway, or maybe he doesn't understand it. Maybe he rejects it, but not with any reason to reject it, right? Notice on Joe Rogan, he didn't say like, well, they claim there's a difference, but ultimately methyl mercury and ethyl mercury don't actually operate differently. Like if he had a claim like that, okay, maybe he's engaging in the way an expert does, but he doesn't do that, right? And it's the kind of thing that makes me wonder about why doesn't he do that? Why does he approach it the way he does? It's about a lot of it. It's about I'm looking at credibility and also motivation. Why? And I do wonder about a lot of these. Like, I don't know why RFK Jr. is like big on like anti-vax stuff, including like the Andrew Wakefield stuff. Maybe he bought into it, and now it's a lot of people like buy into a thing, and then the more committed they are, the harder it is for evidence to dissuade them. But people have all sorts of reasons why they get caught up in the first place, and being this devoted to it and this unwilling to look at like that's really basic, and it's a thing he feels strongly enough about to talk about it on huge platforms like this. It makes you wonder, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
But if this is all you know about ethylmercury versus methylmercury, it's completely reasonable to ask, is ethylmercury associated with vaccines safe? But I have a little rule of thumb for you. If you have a scientific question like that, you can pretty much bet that scientists somewhere in the world have asked and tried to answer that question.
And by the way, there's a huge difference between I have a question like that and I will state confidently to Joe Rogan that there isn't a difference. Like that I know the answer and the scientists are wrong about it, which is basically what he's saying, right? Um, I also would have that question. I don't understand this stuff. That's why we're coming here to someone who knows significantly more than I do, so that these kinds of questions can be answered. And that was, in fact, when I reached out to Dr. Wilson, that was what I was trying to make clear. Was like, I'm not trying to be like, hey, debate me. This would be a good opportunity to answer a lot of questions that people who don't understand might have in a context where I'm not asking you to debate me. I'm asking you to help me understand, and it's important to have those questions answered. And it's really it's kind of I lament sometimes that conspiracy theorists and whatever deniers, there are lots of different kinds of deniers who do this, have tainted the concept of asking questions. I mean, it's even a meme, right? Like, oh, just asking questions. That's something Holocaust deniers say, because they know what they're doing is they're leading you in a direction. But sometimes there are legitimate questions, and questions meant to that are not meant to be like, well, obviously there's no good answer, but questions of I don't understand, and I would like to understand this better. And it really sucks that um, that people who like I said, like whatever deniers, including Holocaust deniers, have so tainted the idea that you can ask questions, because sometimes there are questions that not understanding is something that we should work to alleviate, and sometimes asking questions is how you do that. If you ask them in good faith, that's how you can get productive, informative, educational conversations. If you ask them in bad faith, that's you get literal Holocaust denial or anti-vaccine hysteria or whatever else. And it just kind of sucks.
In this case, scientists all over the world have already asked and answered that question. It's kind of what scientists do. We ask questions and answer them for a living. There have been large population level studies using databases like the Vaccine Safety Data Link, looking at how thimerosal exposure, again, thimerosal is the mercury containing compound in some vaccines, affects neurophysiological outcomes in children at ages 7 to 10
And like
years.
RFK has to have encountered this, right? Or at the very least had people point him at this kind of information. Like, I wonder what does he have a contention with it? I don't know. We don't hear about it in the way.
Thimerosal containing vaccines are not associated with deficits in neurophysiological functioning. These findings are repeated in several different studies.
Like the reason why I don't give him credit for having encountered this and unprocessed it and having disagreements of it, by the way, is because he sums it up to Joe Rogan as there's no such thing as a good mercury. That is so wildly without nuance that it feels like he hasn't read the kinds of things like this that would disagree with his position, even if he's encountered them or have been sent them or like shown them by people who are trying to give him the information.
These studies have not just been done in the US by the CDC, but all over the world by different groups of researchers belonging to different institutions and universities. Before I move further, it's worth mentioning that thimerosal is no longer an ingredient in childhood vaccines.
No.
It was removed as an ingredient.
So it's also not in them. Okay. It was removed in 2001? This guy has been... Oh my god. Oh wow, that's funny. It's like literally right here. As we mentioned that. Hold on. When did he start his anti-vaccine advocacy? Because I could have sworn I saw it was like 2015 or something like that. He joined this group in 2015. Okay, in 2005 he was writing about this. Like, I don't see anything before. Yeah, I don't see any. I'm on glancing for dates. I don't see any dates here that were before. What is it? 2001, and he's still talking about it like it's in here. I mean, maybe he's talking about other vaccines, but like, again, the kind of dishonesty. Like, is he just not paying attention? Is he being dishonest? I don't have a way of knowing, but either way, that's pretty damning, right?
Thimerosal is only in certain flu vaccines, and you can opt to choose flu vaccines that do not have
Oh,
thimerosal.
oh, and other vaccines you can get without it. But he's out here like all vaccines have this thing. This is kind of what I was talking about when I was mentioning that mentioning previously that Andrew Wakefield didn't even have issues with vaccines generally. He had a specific issue with the MMR vaccine in combination. Uh, but it's been taken to be anti-all vaccine. This is like another like tendency of conspiracy of like of broadening and just obliterating nuance. Right? Even the progenitor of this hysteria didn't say what people have taken it to mean. And in the same way, right? Like RFK out here saying like, vaccines have thimerosal and that's mercury and all mercury is bad, completely obliterating the nuance of no, a lot of them don't. Childhood ones haven't since before you've been an activist on this subject. Uh, the the flu vaccine you can get without it, probably if I remember correctly, because of this anti-vaccine movement. That is why that version of the vaccine was created. But it's not actually a problem anyway. But he just boils all of that down. I mean, maybe in the full thing he has more context, but I sincerely doubt it, given that he's willing again to say just like there's no such thing as a good mercury or whatever.
But Robert claims that they are dangerous specifically for pregnant women. Let's talk about why that's not true. Like I said, ethylmercury is the mercury-containing breakdown product of thimerosal, and included in the many safety studies done on thimerosal over several decades are studies done on the safety of thimerosal-containing vaccines in pregnant women.
That actually reminds me of the kind of thing. I know we're pausing a lot, but there's just really dense with information, which I like. I'm glad there's so much to talk and think about. But that's something that often gets hand waved by conspiracy theorists, especially like anti-vaccine conspiracy theorists, is that there's huge amounts of tests and studies and safety precautions taken to make sure specifically that the worries that these people have aren't real and that these products are safe and whatever. And they just have to hand wave. They have to either like act like it doesn't exist or it was skipped in some way or there was some like canoodling or there's some conspiracy in the CDC. They have to work around this like how much effort goes into demonstrating the safety. Like you can't just like capsule something in a pill and be like I'm gonna sell this at the market now as a drug. That's not how that works. You have to go through a lot of processes to make sure it's safe. But people like RFK Jr. are gonna just be like, oh no, it's not safe for women, as if there's for pregnant women, as if it hadn't been tested.
These studies reaffirm that ethylmercury does not accumulate and does not cause harm to the fetal brain like methylmercury does. We know this because we can measure the clearance of mercury from the body after vaccination, and we see that pretty much all of the mercury that would come from the breakdown of thimerosal after vaccination is excreted harmlessly from the body. So not only is there practically no risk of thimerosal in vaccines to pregnant women, but pregnant women are at increased risk of severe outcomes from infectious diseases like influenza. Vaccination is
And again, that's another thing that gets hand waved by the anti-vax types is they will act like the vaccines are being done for no reason whatsoever. Remember, vaccines we invented vaccines as a concept to prevent really horrific diseases, and I'm glad Dr. Wilson points this out of like pregnant women are more at risk of infections like influenza. That's really important. This isn't just like like there's this risk you think exists but doesn't versus nothing. It's this risk that you're making up versus diseases that kill people. And it's pretty important.
an incredibly important tool for preventing these kinds of severe outcomes to diseases like influenza in pregnant women. Because if they experience those severe outcomes, then they or their unborn baby could possibly die. So Robert's claims here could needlessly scare a pregnant woman into putting herself into a much more dangerous position than is necessary.
And we know that that happens because it has happened with the Andrew Wakefield scare. Hold on, I probably can find this. Um, I've seen a graph on this. I was hoping to. I have seen a graph on this regarding the. Okay, so that's 2022. Okay. No. Well, we see the increased cases of measles uh, after the scare Wakefield started, but that's not what I'm looking for. Uh, Measles vaccination by country. Why doesn't it go back far enough? Measles and MMR statistics. Maybe this is what I'm looking for. Okay. This might be notifications, uptake rate. Nope, that's not what I'm looking for. Cases of measles, vaccine uptake. Yeah, okay, you can see right here. So 1995, 1996, this is when Wakefield's study came out, and there was a huge media shitstorm about it. England is this black line here, and you can see after the scare, the percentage of 2-year-olds receiving the MMR vaccine dropped significantly. Also in is that Scotland? I can't tell the difference in the colors because I have a light filter on my computer, but like you can see that these scares do have impacts to this the amount people take vaccines. And if you're like an anti-vaxxer or whatever, I'm not going to convince you that that's a bad thing. But if you understand and realize, like, yeah, vaccines prevent very serious diseases, as we see with the upticks in the amount of uh, measles cases, that like this scare is this drop is a very real harm, and and this is why. So I hope that's clear of like why these people are dangerous.
Why was thimerosal introduced into
It was
vaccines?
allegedly introduced as a preservative, but it doesn't kill. It doesn't kill streptococcus or any of the other contaminants you would be worried about. In fact, it kills brain cells.
So in that statement, there were lies and completely misleading statements.
Okay.
Thimerosal was never
See,
meant to be
again,
an adjuvant. There
I
was
wouldn't know how to, like, I would just have to listen to that and be like, oh, that's probably true, even though, or I'm more likely I wouldn't trust him at this point, and so that's probably not true, but not be able to know why. This is why
zero
we have the
evidence for
lens
that
here.
in the scientific literature. It was always there to be meant as a preservative. The main purpose of thimerosal in vaccines is to act as something we call a bacteriostatic agent, not necessarily to outright kill bacteria, but to prevent them from growing. You can
Oh,
imagine why it would be important to prevent bacterial growth, why a
yeah, that makes
drug
sense.
that you inject into your body is sitting on the shelf waiting to be used or being shipped to its final destination. Thimerosal has indeed been tested in experiments we call MIC-MBC, or minimal inhibitory concentration, or minimal bactericidal concentrations. And what we see is that thimerosal does indeed work as a preservative. It does also kill human cells. Kennedy is not lying about that part. However, in the concentrations that it is present in the vaccine, it will not be present in those same concentrations once it is injected into your body. Again, just think about this for a minute. You want the concentration of thimerosal or whatever preservative you're using to be a certain amount while it's in the vial so that it can do its job of preventing bacteria from growing. However, when it's injected into your body, that concentration immediately gets diluted to a point where it's not going to have that same biological effect that it did in the vial.
Well, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's the kind of thing like I wouldn't have thought of, and definitely anti-vaxxers do not talk about, right? Because I mean, it's an enormous hole in their fear mongering, but yeah, I wouldn't have thought that the concentration would have been an issue. It's really interesting.
So, no, it's not going to kill your brain cells, it's just going to keep your vaccine safe.
So they, at
And
that point,
again, as he mentioned previously, and it's important to remind ourselves, not just that he said this, but that that's been tested a lot to make sure. And if it was killing brain cells left and right, there wouldn't be three cranks screaming about it on the internet. There would be a pretty significant uh, section of the scientific community talking about this. This would be an actual issue and not just you know a guy who believes things that are demonstrably false yelling about it on Joe Rogan. I know he's not yelling, but like you know, allow me to embellish slightly.
when vaccinologists went around searching around the world to find the most horrendously toxic materials to add to vaccines.
No, that's not how vaccine science works. Adjuvants are first and foremost tested for safety. For example, an
Yep.
aluminum phosphate compound called alum, which is a very commonly used adjuvant where adjuvants are used,
I don't know
has
what an
been
adjuvant is.
extensively safety tested over several decades.
Yeah, of course.
And when it comes
right?
to
But like
aluminum-based
they act like they remember what people are willing to overlook is pretty important. I think to understanding how they're approaching their positions and convincing people that he's willing to just overlook the amount of testing. It's pretty relevant.
adjuvants, scientists have asked all the questions and answered them. They've tested whether or not it accumulates in your body. It does not. They've tested whether or not it is associated with any adverse neurological outcomes. It is not. And it's been tested whether or not it significantly adds to the exposure of aluminum that you already encounter in your environment every single day, and it does not.
And
It's
I'd like you like as Dr. Wilson like puts forth all this information, like you can go like appraise it if you want. Like I don't think any of us has the I mean maybe some people have the academic background to really like understand what's written in these things, but like I just want you to realize how much stuff, how much information, how much study, how much work and evidence has to be disregarded by the conspiracy theorist, because this is this is at least the fourth time, maybe not at least, like this is probably like the fourth time just in this video that RFK needed to have not known about or not referenced or not factored in this information that proves him wrong. And like how many times can you do that before you just go, this guy either doesn't know what he's talking about and should, and so he's like negligent in his position, or he's actively lying to you. Like how much can you hand wave of like, why doesn't he know about this? Why doesn't he know about this? Why doesn't he know about this? You know.
claims about adjuvants are yet another tired, endlessly debunked anti-vaccine claim.
In like 1979, they brought on a vaccine called the diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis vaccine, and that vaccine was very dangerous, and it was killing or giving severe brain damage to 1 in 300 kids, and it was pulled in the United States. It was pulled in Europe.
So as a note, let's assume everything he just said is true. Dubious assumption to be sure. But let's just assume everything he just said is true. This is what I mean about like if vaccines were actually causing this demonstrable harm, there wouldn't just be a couple of cranks yelling about it. Because notice he's saying like it got pulled in multiple countries because of the harm it was doing. Because we have systems in place designed specifically for the purpose of making sure that these drugs are safe, and when they're not, for preventing additional harm being done from them, pulling them, trying to deal with treatment, so on and so forth. It is insufficient, obviously, that it in any case where someone is harmed, if the state doesn't also help them with their medical problems caused from this, and so on and so forth. And like, I think there's a legitimate claim, a legitimate argument to like maybe we should be able to sue the government for truly harmful drugs being allowed through their processes. But notice that if like again, assuming everything he's saying is true, and I don't know that I trust that it is, governments responded when they realized the harm and prevented further harm. But we're going to act like that doesn't happen for every other vaccine, because remember, he has a problem with every vaccine. But we're going to act like there are like clearly governments step in when there's real harms, except for all the times they don't. Is the kind of thing he has to say, you know?
But Bill Gates still gives it to 161 million African children every year.
The same.
So Bill Gates, you might notice, is not a government actor. There's actually been a decent amount of discussion about how billionaires do demonstrable harm in foreign countries when they have their own particular bugaboo. Like Bill Gates is, as I understand, overly concerned about polio and has gotten in the way of solving other problems because so much money has to be funneled towards polio prevention that could be used elsewhere, but it has to be funneled that way because he's a funder and that's what he wants. Bill Gates is not the person to whom we should be. Should not be a person that has that kind of power. Nobody should be singularly that powerful to affect this kind of impact in the world. But that's a problem of systems like capitalism, which allows billionaires to even exist and to have the power that they do, not a problem of vaccines. And like I doubt this guy's a socialist, you know? Like it's weird to be like, yeah, I don't know. But like he wants to get mad about the vaccines, not about the fact that Bill Gates has this kind of power.
Vaccine.
Same vaccine. And to South Asian kids.
That's just a lie.
Oh, okay, cool.
Tdap
That's what I
and
thought.
DTaP are different vaccines. They both give you immunity to diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, but they're slightly different formulations.
This is also like how conspiracy theorists, another instance of how conspiracy theorists approach things is they'll say, "Oh, this is a vaccine for the same thing, therefore the vaccine must be identical to this other one." Right, like this is because notice it was like I forget what the thing was, like diphtherium or whatever the diseases were. These are two different vaccines for the same set of diseases, and he's treating them like the same because they're for the same set of diseases. It demonstrates a lack of understanding of what you're talking about, because of course he has a lack of understanding of what he's talking about. If he didn't, he wouldn't be an anti-vaxxer.
One is meant for children under the age of 7,
And
the
boom,
other is meant for
here's data.
people over the age of 7. Tdap is the one that is for people over the age of 7. It's never been pulled from the market in America.
Oh,
I
interesting.
got mine a few years ago before I had my first child. He's just lying here. There is absolutely no
course.
evidence to suggest that it was killing or giving brain damage to 1 in 300 children. Another complete lie. The safety profile of these vaccines is extensive. They have been tested in clinical trials. They have gone through a lot of safety testing in several different populations over many, many years. All of it comes to the exact same conclusion, that these vaccines are very safe. They work really well against the diseases that they are meant to protect, and there's just no reason to forego them and put yourself at more risk than you would be without them.
And for people who like RFK Jr. or Del Bigtree or whoever else that's like this, I just want to ask the same thing that I was asking when we were watching Del Bigtree and Neil deGrasse Tyson, of like, how many times does it have to be demonstrated? Like, how many times do they have to lie to you in a way that's demonstrable and clearly, like, they eat, like, oh, I guess it's theoretically he's not lying. He might just be ignorant of literally everything that he's talking about, right? Like, but how many times does it have to be the point of like he either knows nothing or is openly lying to you? How many times does that have to happen before you start to like go, hey, maybe this guy is full of shit? Like, how much of that before it has an impact?
And that's the problem with not doing, real placebo-controlled trials. None of the vaccines are ever subjected to true placebo-controlled trials. It's the only medical product that is exempt from that prior to licensure.
This is just a huge lie.
Oh, look,
Every
again.
first vaccine before it goes to market
Hey, Amazon,
is tested in randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled trials.
Oh,
Kennedy
so they
has
are
not-
tested that way. Again, he's saying so confidently the opposite of the truth. Like, how many times does he have to do that? And in this case, it's one of those, like, if you're saying this that openly and you don't know what you're talking about, you are lying. I'm sorry. Like, there's a point to which, like, ignorance can be a lie. I go back and forth as to whether I agree with Aaron Ra when he says, like, saying something confidently that you do not know to be true, that you cannot demonstrate to be true, is the same as a lie. I'm less I'm less stern about that. I'm not sure if I go that far. Sometimes people will say things they think are true, but they couldn't necessarily demonstrate. Maybe they trust from someone else or whatever else, and that's not necessarily a lie, you know. That's but like something like this, something that blatant, that easy to check, and that integral to his advocacy. If you don't know that, you're trying not to know that, and that is dishonest to the point of lying. So there's actually no two ways about this. It's not that he either doesn't know or he's lying. It's either he's lying or he went out of his way to not know so he could lie, you know? And like, how many times does that have to happen before people start to take issue with it?
Made this claim
I mean,
so many
obviously,
times.
never, right? Like, for a lot of these people, they're never going to look at this information, and they're going to assume everyone else is lying about everything. But like, if you're able to process this information, which I think people ought to be able to do, in like, otherwise, like, I would argue your brain is broken. Like, if you're able to process information, it's clearly lying to you.
And it is so easy to debunk. The polio vaccine trials back in 1954 were famously randomized, double-blind, and saline placebo-controlled, all the way up to just a few years ago, where COVID vaccine clinical trials were famously randomized, double-blind, and saline placebo-controlled. Joe Rogan's podcast is the most listened to podcast in the world, and he has said repeatedly that he will try to make his show better about spreading misinformation and do better fact-checking. And yet, he has the biggest anti-vaxxer in the world sitting in front of him, and he's making such a huge lie that Joe and Jamie just don't fact-check.
I would chalk this up a little bit to them just being, well, I will agree that that is highly dishonest. I'll chalk it up a little bit to just be, or not dishonest, excuse me, highly irresponsible. They're not experts on it, and obviously, if you're not an expert, you're not going to be able to like debunk on the fly. That's something that's really difficult. Something that maybe when you make video essays is a little harder to recognize, because like you have time to debunk this stuff. Maybe you would know this off the top of your head because like you are an expert in the field, but when if you're not, it'd be like, who would like, I wouldn't think that someone would lie to me about something like that. You would want to have another expert there to contradict him. But as far as I know, that's not how Joe Rogan does his podcast. It's an interview, not setting up multiple guests to argue with each other. If he did that, which I think would be good when you're bringing on people who are going to make highly irresponsible health claims, like if he did that, that would be really good. But because he doesn't, it's like the problem is format. Like, maybe he shouldn't be bringing people like this on for this reason. I'm not going to disagree that this is highly irresponsible. I just like a little bit understanding of like, well, the format is such that he doesn't really have the means of doing that. But he's putting himself in this situation, right? Like, it's his show. He chose for it to be like this. It doesn't absolve him of responsibility. I think it's just, I think I'm just splitting hairs on the kind of responsibility that I think Joe is like failing to meet in this case. It is really splitting hairs. It was just, I don't know. It seemed relevant to talk about, at least.
What are we doing here?
What they were trying to say is there was this huge decline in mortalities from infectious disease that took place in the 20th century. An 80% drop in deaths from infectious disease.
Is this guy going to
And
attribute
what
any of that to
caused
vaccines?
Was it vaccines? And what they said is no. It had
Who's they?
very little, almost nothing to do with vaccines.
There's
This is a very
no
common
way.
one I
What?
hear from anti-vaxxers. It is in fact true that in the 20th century, a lot of improvements to the way we live and take care of ourselves contributed to a decline in mortality.
Yeah.
And these changes did not have to do with vaccines.
Not
But
completely,
despite having
anyway.
made big improvements to life expectancy and child mortality, there was still a lot of improvement to be made. We still had huge waves of cases of measles and polio, pertussis, diphtheria. With every single wave of these diseases, not only would children die, but you would have permanent damage. For example, let's just take measles. Before vaccines in America,
Oh, so I was
measles
literally
would
about to
kill
look this
about
up.
4 to
I'm
500
glad
kids a year.
he just
It would
has this.
hospitalize about 50,000 kids every year. All of those kids would go to the hospital, get expensive treatment, and suffer. About 1,000 cases of those who survived would result in brain swelling called encephalitis. Many more would develop subsequent ear infections after their measles case and develop.
Oh, and by the way,
many
just
more
like real
of
quick,
those.
because I was running the math in my head, like, we can like, uh, we can. Oh, I guess was running it on the wrong numbers, but like that, like 1,500 people. We'll take the high end, right? Like 1,500 people were severely harmed by this disease out of 3 to 4 million. Like, that's a pretty big deal. Not to mention the 50,000 hospitalizations. Like, this is a pretty significant amount of people who get it. This isn't just like, oh, you get it and you're 90%, or I guess it is 90% plus, but like you'll just be fine. But like, why roll the dice at all? Remember, what are we getting in return for not inoculating ourselves? According to people like this, like everything, like we're getting everything. You'll die if you get a vaccine. But like actually, what is like actually they claim happens with disease, like the autism? Autism is the thing. Like autism, it's again like, remember, he'd rather risk this than have someone be autistic. That's fucked up. If like being autistic is fine, but like you'd rather die, you know?
Who survived would result in brain swelling called
Stupid.
encephalitis. Many more would develop subsequent ear infections after their measles case and develop permanent deafness. Similarly,
Yeah.
death isn't the only bad outcome when it comes to diseases like polio. Do you want thousands of children to be paralyzed every single day?
And by the way, it's like important to remember that the hospitalizations aren't nothing. Even if you're like if you're hospitalized and you don't like have these lifelong these lifelong repercussions, some people might look at that and be like, "Oh, so you're fine." But maybe the individuals are fine, but like just imagine the impact on our hospitals if this many more people all the time need to be hospitalized for these serious diseases. This is what we were talking about during the beginning of of the COVID pandemic. This is why the stay-at-home orders and the masks were so important. Was just like, we, even if you will likely be okay if you get hospitalized, we can't have so many people in our hospitals that it overruns the system. So many more people will die just by needing to by increasing the necessity for hospitalization, just because there won't be room for it. We don't have enough beds to handle all these issues, and this is the kinds of thing that also gets like the people will forget about, because even now we're talking about like paralyzation and brain damage and death and whatever. Like, yeah, that's all horrendous, but bad enough to have all these people filling the hospitals. That's already bad enough. It's already bad enough that people get the disease at all, because remember, the other side of it is actual nothing. Nothing that has ever been demonstrated as like, oh, vaccines are therefore always bad, you know? He'll talk about things that he'll talk about potential things, but then immediately debunked.
That would be the reality without polio vaccines. The reality is that not only have vaccines saved the lives of millions of people over the past few decades, but it has also driven case rates of diseases down
Yeah.
to practically nothing. These are the graphs that anti vaxxers never show you,
Yeah,
and the
they'll
ones that
never talk
Robert
about it.
never addresses.
Because
And that's another, like, how many things do people like this have to not address before like you start to go, hey, maybe this guy's lying to me.
why? Because Reagan caved in, and it wasn't just Reagan; it was the Democrats. My uncle was chairing the health committee at that time, and the Democrats also went along. They passed the Vaccine Act in 1986, and the Vaccine Act gave immunity from liability to all vaccine companies if for
That
any
seems
injury for negligence.
unlikely.
No matter how negligent you are, no matter how reckless your
Another instance of like, I don't know if that's true. I would look it up, but I'm guessing Dr. Wilson is going to demonstrate why it's not. But at this point, this is why the lens is important. Again, if I just watched this interview, I would have encountered that and not really had the tools to know whether I should be checking whether it's true or not. But at this point, I've seen him lie so many times. I'm assuming everything he says is not true, which has been pretty safe so far. And we'll see. We'll see if that's true also. I'm guessing it's not.
conduct, no matter how toxic the ingredient, how shoddily tested or manufactured the product, no matter how grievous your injury, your vaccine company, you cannot be sued.
Another huge lie. In America, the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program started because many people were believing that their children were being harmed by DTaP vaccines. So many parents believed that their children were being harmed by these vaccines and suing vaccine manufacturers that vaccine manufacturers said, we're not making money off of this, we're just going to stop making these vaccines. So the government actually stepped in and said, no, we need you to keep making these vaccines, so let's figure this out.
So, one moment. I do need to take this. Apologies for that. In any case, yeah. So it seems like the actual story was that anti-vax whack jobs were inundating companies trying to save lives with vaccines by suing them repeatedly over hysteria over a thing that wasn't happening, that people like RFK Jr. were saying were lying to them about, and in order to get vaccines to continue to be produced because they do cause good in the world, the CDC like the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program had to. Well, we'll see what the result
So
was.
the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program essentially was started as a means to have citizens who believe that they were vaccine injured sue and get compensation for their injuries without suing the pharmaceutical companies directly.
Oh, so it's suing the state instead of the companies? Yeah, that seems like okay, sure. You could argue like that could lead to negative incentives, but that problem was caused by people like RFK Jr. Like he's literally complaining that his advocacy caused more harm in the world. Now he's not going to put it in that way, but that's what he's talking about. Now I think it is kind of bad that like companies are less liable for the harm they cause. It encourages more. It means that they are less encouraged to prevent harm or with their products or to avoid causing harm. I guess is a way I'd prefer to put it. That said, uh, there's still like there's still a lot of checks beyond that. That's not the only thing protecting the consumer from malfeasance, and it's only in existence because of a hysteria over harm that wasn't being caused. It's really important.
By the way, those parents who thought their children were being harmed by Tdap vaccines, that was investigated, and it was found that those vaccines had nothing to do with those children's cases of encephalitis. But to get to the meat of Kennedy's claim here, nothing in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program or any relevant law says that vaccine manufacturers are immune from negligence or fraud.
Okay.
They certainly are not. Don't believe me? Well,
Yeah,
Kennedy knows that he is lying.
Oh, he
Because
knows
he
he's lying.
himself has sued Merck multiple times
Oh,
over their
interesting.
HPV.
That's really interesting. Now we have the first instance where we know he is lying to you. Again, just like especially for the person who recommended this to me, because I know you're more likely to be on the RFK side of this. Like, does that bother you? He knows he's lying to you here.
vaccine. He is suing vaccine manufacturers because he claims that they are committing fraud and negligence. He's doing what he says isn't allowed. Vaccine manufacturers still have to go through all of the regulations set by the FDA. They are beholden to laws that obligate them to make a drug as safe as possible while following all of the required guidelines to make those drugs as safely as possible. They are required to test their drugs for safety and efficacy. If their drugs don't pass those inspections, their drug doesn't make it to market. And if negligence or fraud involved in that manufacturing or testing slips through the cracks, which is possible, then that manufacturing company can absolutely and will be sued.
Yeah. So he knew he was lying. He knew he was lying, and on top of all that, was hand waving all the other protections that exist that Dr. Wilson just laid out.
And the other thing is they are exempt from pre-licensing safety testing. They don't have to be
Why do I have a
tested.
sneaking suspicion
And
that's
they're
a
not.
lie also?
And I said this for many, many years. I said not one of these 72 vaccines has ever been tested pre-licensing in a placebo-controlled trial where you're looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids and looking for at health outcomes. Never been done.
Yeah, I already explained why this
Yeah.
one's a lie,
No,
but
it happens.
let's roll the
all
studies
the time.
again.
And you can see now how like the lies compound on each other. Once he gets away with the first one, now he can say because that's the case, even though it's not, this is the ramification of the world that would exist if I wasn't lying to you.
But the vaccine schedule immediately after they passed the Vaccine Act exploded because all these companies were rushing to get new vaccines onto the schedule.
Now, this only sounds nefarious if you assume the vaccines are a bad thing, but like, wouldn't that be good? Like, really think about it. Like, all these companies were rushing to prevent diseases from affecting people. Cool. Yeah, that sounds good to me actually. It'd be like saying like once the Feeding People is Good Act was passed, all these companies were rushing to make sure people didn't starve. The horror.
Many of them for diseases that weren't even casually contagious, like ridiculous diseases that are in that, like hepatitis B. Why would you give? You get hepatitis B from, from sharing needles, or from like going to a really seasoned prostitute, or from sort of compulsive homosexual behavior.
This is
Oh,
such a
oh, he's also a homophobe? Fun. I didn't know that. Um, we'll get to that in a moment. But also, can't you get hepatitis B from? Am I thinking something? Can't you also get that from like getting like pricked by like a rusty barb or something like that? Maybe I'm mixing it up with maybe that's tetanus. I don't remember. It's not really important.
bizarre
But
claim
fun. Didn't know he was also homophobic. Cool.
that shows that Robert has no knowledge or respect for medicine. Hepatitis B is pretty serious. Infections that turn chronic can result in
Yeah,
an
and he doesn't give a
increased
shit about it,
risk
right?
of
He'd
liver
rather
cancer.
he's like so anti-vax. He's like, I don't give a shit. It only happens to the gays. Like or the gays or people or he's like drug addicts, people who go to prostitutes, and gay people that are like that clearly he has issues with. And so who cares if they get it? Also, that's not the only way you get it. But also, even if it was like, and these things aren't evil, and even if they were, does that mean like fuck them? They should just get diseases and die? This is some like puritanical shit. Honestly, like not the thing I would have expected given what I would have seen of his political views. That's some like hard right like Christian moralist shit. That's some like Reagan-esque like, well, we don't need to look into AIDS because it's just the gays getting it. Like that's fucked up.
Cancer or cirrhosis of your liver. And the younger that you get infected by this virus, the more likely you are to have a chronic infection that leads to these things. And no, it's not just the things that Robert said that can put you at risk of infection with
Oh yeah.
hepatitis B. Hepatitis B can also be transferred because of bites or sanitary habits. And according to the studies that Robert says don't exist, hepatitis B vaccines are extremely safe and they work really well. There's really no downside to taking them, and it offers real protection against a very potentially serious infection early in life. Taking Robert's advice of foregoing hepatitis B vaccination only puts children at greater risk of chronic hepatitis B infections that will increase their risk of liver cancer or cirrhosis.
And then they started seeing all of this explosion in chronic disease, and particularly autism.
Well, here we go. The claim that vaccines
Yep,
cause
let's
autism.
go. All right,
Robert has
let's
been
get it.
pushing this idea for decades. Remember what I said earlier about if you have a question, scientists have probably already tested and answered that question? Same here. Scientists all over the world have investigated whether or not there is a link between autism and vaccines. They have tested vaccinated versus unvaccinated groups. This includes groups that got a particular vaccine or didn't get a particular vaccine. It also includes groups that received normal childhood vaccinations according to their schedule, and children that received no vaccinations. Some of these studies have followed these children for multiple years, sometimes their whole life, and every single time the studies find that there is no link between vaccines and autism.
And by the way, even the originating paper by Andrew Wakefield, like the originating study, maybe not the paper because the paper is full of lies as well. The originating study couldn't find a link, and that's what he was looking for, and even said he found. He was so motivated that he was willing to lie about what he found, but even he couldn't find a link between these two. And again, he was only looking at one specific vaccine, and it was only for a law, whatever. Like there's all sorts of stuff, but like for a legal case or whatever. And again, you should go look at that H Bomber guy video. But yeah, there isn't this link, and even if there was, like, why are we so opposed? Like, oh God, I hate. I feel like I'm repeating myself so much, but like I don't want it to go without saying, like having autism is so much like first of all isn't like a bad thing in its but also like isn't something that like is so vile that we should risk all these diseases to avoid. It's fine to have autism. It's okay. Even like oh goddamn, I can't handle
None.
this.
now 1 in every 34 kids has autism, and half of those are full blown.
So part of that, by the way, is just we're getting better at diagnosing it. Even when I was a kid, we were pretty bad at diagnosing autism. Um, but like that increased ability doesn't mean oh it didn't exist before. It's just now we know about it. But now I'm glad we're getting the like I don't know what the term is like neurodivergent phobia. I don't know. Now we're getting the bigotry of like look it's so bad there are autistic kids like okay.
Meaning that description.
This is the thing I find most disgusting about anti-vaxxers who
Oh,
think
thank
that
you.
vaccines
I'm
cause
glad
autism.
you agree. Cool.
They often describe autism as a fate worse than death.
Yep.
Some icky and scary outcome for children that make them suffer their whole life. No, just no. Autism is just a brain type. Autistic people have a lot to offer this world. They are valuable people. Autistic people are not a burden. And Robert, you are honestly despicable for thinking that they are.
I really appreciate the full-throated condemnation of this like anti-autism view. I really appreciate that from Dr. Wilson. I think it was very like clear and concise, but unambiguous, and I think it's important to note when someone does something very good like that. Like I'm very glad he said that. I mean, it's one of those like he's saying a lot of really good things, but like it shouldn't go without saying that that kind of very clear stance is something I appreciate. I'm glad he did it.
Now, what's the conventional explanation for that?
Well, I mean, there's no real explanation.
How do they try to
They
explain?
try to say, well, we're just noticing it more, which is ridiculous.
Robert can
Is
say
it
that's
ridiculous? Why
but
is that ridiculous?
He's wrong. Pretty much all the experts agree that autism diagnoses have increased because of an increased understanding of the autism spectrum.
Now I'm curious, when was autism? Yeah, sure, we'll call it discovered. I don't know what the term is. Like, the concept of autism was coined in 1911. That means, like, if you look at the 1800s, there will be 0 cases. Is that is it ridiculous to say it? Like, like you could use his logic to say like that in the 1800s there were no cases and in the 1950s there were some. That means that whatever thing World War II, sure, caused autism. Like no, like there was an now we have an understanding of a thing. That understanding has been improving. Uh, it's been uh oh wait what? Oh, I'm getting different results. Okay, so that's National Institute of but like in the Wikipedia it's saying that was when it was first coined, but it was first diagnosed in 1982. Oh, so it's even more recent than that. So like, yeah, he's gonna look around and be like, none of my friends growing up had autism. Well, they might have. There just wasn't a diagnosis yet. And yeah, that's gonna have an impact on the number of cases you see. And the more, it's the similar thing with homosexuality, where like yeah, when people stop getting literally incarcerated or killed, like Alan Turing, literally sterilized by the state for being gay. When that doesn't happen to people anymore, suddenly you'll see them in society where they're no longer afraid of repercussion. That's good, by the way. That doesn't mean that like we're like it's ridiculous to like it's really wild to be like, oh, it's ridiculous that we're just better able to see it now. No, because we couldn't diagnose it before, and we're getting better. Our understanding is improving.
In fact, when these criteria are applied to older age groups that would have been missed in their diagnosis at younger ages, we find that those autism rates are similar between generations.
You know, and of course we know why, as aluminum adjuvants give you allergies. They're designed to make you, to create a hyperimmune response to foreign particles.
Wait, did he just say that we know that why there's more autism? It's because aluminum makes you allergic to things? That's what he said, right? Like barring the mumbo jumbo, like that's what he said. That's what the fuck is that? Okay.
Form particles. what's he even talking about?
Oh, okay, you're
Anytime
also
throughout
confused.
this
Cool.
interview, when he tries to talk about actual molecular mechanisms, he just stumbles all over his words and falls flat. He can't explain anything because he doesn't know anything.
So we are the sickest generation in history. There's no other country in the world that has this kind of chronic disease epidemic.
Robert, just think about that for a minute. You think that vaccines are contributing to this increase in chronic diseases in America. Did you stop to consider that many European countries have better childhood vaccination coverage
Oh,
than we
he
do?
can't contend with that, so
And their
he's not
chronic
going to talk
disease
about
is
it. I don't know if he knows this information. He doesn't seem like he's looking for actual information on the subject. But even if he did, he would probably immediately blot it from his mind. Like, yeah, there's no
issues are
way he's
not
gonna ever
as bad as the
think about this
US.
information if he ever sees it.
Maybe it's not vaccines. Yeah, he definitely didn't think about that one.
Wi-Fi radiation is it does all kinds of bad things, including causing cancer.
Wi-Fi radiation causes
Yeah, from your cell phone. I mean, there's cell phone tumors. You know that. I mean, I'm representing.
Oh,
hundreds of
he's a
people who
cell
have
phones
cell phone
cause
tumors
tumors
behind the
guy.
ear.
Holy
It's
shit!
always on the
Is there a single medical conspiracy he doesn't believe? This guy is incredible.
ear that you favor with your cell phone.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Now
Much
Robert's saying
appreciated.
Wi-Fi causes cancer.
Oh, God. Wi-Fi. Oh, I missed that one.
No, it doesn't. And the reason is very simple. When it comes to radiation like radio waves, microwaves, X-rays, etc., there are generally two kinds, ionizing and non-ionizing. Putting it simply, ionizing radiation is strong enough
my
to
God.
break the bonds within your cell's DNA. That causes DNA damage and increases your risk of cancer. Ionizing radiations that do this are things like X-rays.
Also, like, how much you want to bet he says it about Wi-Fi but not radio because he's a fucking boomer and he's like, well, radio's been around, so I'm used to that, and Wi-Fi is new, so that's scary. Like, why is radio not a thing he's losing his shit at? Like, you might want to, like, someone who agrees with him might say, oh, because we know radio waves don't do that. We also know Wi-Fi doesn't do that. To be clear, it's clearly not data that we're going off of. It's like feels, and he's used to radio, so he's like, nah, radio's fine. But like Wi-Fi causes the whatever, the cancers or whatever, because he's a fucking boomer. Like, ugh.
Which is why you wear that giant lead vest every time you get an X-ray at the dentist. Other forms of radiation, like radio waves, which is what Wi-Fi is, are
Oh,
non.
I didn't even realize that Wi-Fi are radio waves. So yeah, he's out here like Wi-Fi causes cancer, but like radio is cool. No, he's not out there protesting like that radio stations should have to like all be taken off the air.
Ionizing. They are not strong enough to break the bonds in your DNA, they do not cause DNA damage, and they do not increase your risk of cancer. Are there ways other than direct DNA damage?
And he felt
that...
confident saying this, given like with either without knowing about or irrespective of being or even though he is aware of all this data that proves him wrong.
that radiation could increase your risk of cancer? Yes, but that radiation would have to be strong enough to penetrate through your skin and into your tissues. And Wi-Fi doesn't do that.
Wi-Fi radiation opens up your blood-brain barrier. And so all these toxins that are in your body can now go into your brain.
How does Wi-Fi radiation open up your blood-brain barrier?
Yeah, now you're gone beyond my.
That's almost like the wrong
my
question.
Okay.
expertise.
No. We've long since gone beyond your expertise. You felt comfortable lying about shit you don't know about. Just keep it going. Just no. Tell us, how does it work? This when people like this say something like that, this is where I start to be like, oh, this is where you're so full of shit, you know that you can't defend yourself. Like, that's the only thing I can take away. Because obviously he was beyond his expertise when he said the previous statement. What made a difference here? Also, that's the wrong question, Joe. The correct question is, why are you lying about that?
But what?
Decent question, Joe, but as you can see, when asked for mechanisms, Robert stumbles over his words and can't give an answer. Because he doesn't actually know. Because he doesn't know anything on this
Because
topic.
it's not real.
What are we doing?
Even after I got over COVID, I had people that I like, that I admired. They were telling me you should get vaccinated now. I said, why?
Yeah.
Why? This is, make it make sense to me. Sanjay Gupta said that to me. I'm like, make it make sense to me.
So next, we're getting into COVID topics,
I
and
mean,
Joe
I could make
starts
it make
by
sense to you. Well,
asking.
I could make it make sense. I don't know that I could make it make sense to you, but like the simple version is natural immunity wears off, is my understanding. Natural immunity doesn't last that long, and also even if you have natural immunity, a vaccine will compound your defenses or whatever. Like it's not like it's impossible to get it again. People have gotten COVID multiple times.
Why it makes sense to get vaccinated after he's recovered from COVID. This question was answered pretty early on after
Like the
vaccines were
real
rolled
easy
out.
answer is like,
It
do you
has
want
to
to go
do
through
with
that shit
something called
again? No.
somatic
All right.
hypermutation. Upon multiple exposures to an antigen, your immune system will broaden its capability to respond to that antigen. In the case of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID, if you get infected and survive it, presumably without any horrible long-lasting effects, then if you get vaccinated on top of that, then your body will further train itself against SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah. Very
What
easy
you
to
end
make it
up
make
getting
sense.
is a broadening immunity that will protect you against more variants. This was empirically measured in 2021, where people who had recovered from COVID and then gotten just one dose of COVID vaccine had amazing immunity. This is because your immune system is able to capture antigen, bring it to immune organs called lymph nodes, and within those lymph nodes, there are structures called germinal centers. In those germinal centers, the cells that make antibodies, which are your B cells, are training themselves to make better and better antibodies against that antigen while that germinal center is active. And we know that vaccination is really good at stimulating these long-lasting germinal centers that give you better and better immunity as time goes on. And to be extremely clear here, I'm talking immunity against disease. Immune memory is what we're going for with these vaccines. You want your immune system to be able to remember that it encountered SARS-CoV-2 antigen and be able to recall it
Oh
whenever it
yeah, here's
encounters.
that graph again of like, hey, look, so way fewer people die that are vaccinated as opposed to unvaccinated. Seems important, but all right.
The real thing. That's what these vaccines are really good at doing, and that's why getting vaccinated after you get infected is really important because it's going to better protect you against not just the circulating variant at the time, but future variants as well. I'm simplifying this as much as possible, but we've got a lot more misinformation to get to, so if you're more interested in this, links are in the description.
And that they concentrated on this one medication that my doctor prescribed for me, which was ivermectin. They didn't concentrate on all the other stuff that I took. They didn't concentrate on the Z-Pack. They didn't concentrate on the prednisone. They didn't concentrate on the monoclonal antibodies or the IV drip of vitamins that I did, and NAD, the NAD plus
Wow, was there
cocktail. I did a lot of
any
stuff.
nonsense you
I
didn't
did
put
all
in your
the same
body?
stuff.
Yeah, and I
It's wild that like these people are willing to like take all of these things, but not the vaccine, right? Like it's so wild. Like for how much they act like they're very like, oh well, it's really important that you watch what you put in your body. You're just like, let me get that horse dewormer. I know ivermectin has other uses. Like let me put this and that and this other thing and like put all these millions of things, anything to avoid a vaccine. But like why?
got better quick, and
Yeah, me too.
but no one cared that I got better. That was not the narrative.
Oh
The
no,
narrative is
we
like Joe
care because
Rogan
you
is
now
taking
you're doing
veterinary
more harm in the
medication.
world. But
Joe
you know,
seems to be really upset about how the media treated him after he got COVID. Look, Joe, I'm glad you got better. I'm happy that you didn't experience the terrible outcomes that millions of others did, including healthy people your age. But you are the host of the most listened to podcast in the world, and you were telling people that you took ivermectin and that it helped you. That's misinformation. It just is. I keep telling you that scientists really like to ask and answer questions. And we asked the question, does ivermectin work against COVID? And the answer was no. It's really been tested every which way. It doesn't help you once you're already in the hospital. It doesn't prevent people from getting into the hospital with COVID. It doesn't work at lower doses, doesn't work at higher doses. It just doesn't work. All of these have been tested. It just doesn't work. And yet Joe Rogan, the host of the most listened to podcast in the world, said that it helped him and would
Yep.
not budge on it despite this evidence.
This is why this is another instance of us seeing why it's important to approach things scientifically. Humans are a predisposition towards false positives, basically to think a thing is related even though it's not. The best example I've heard of this is to understand what the difference is between a false positive and a false negative is, if you're wandering around the savannah and you hear a rustle in the grass, and you go, oh, it's a tiger, and you book it, and it wasn't a tiger, that's a false positive, right? You thought it was a thing, and it wasn't that thing. Uh, Whereas a false negative would be you think if you hear the rustling in the grass and you're like, ah, it's just the wind, and then it was a tiger. Well, I guess tigers aren't in the savannah. Excuse me, a lion. And it wasn't the wind. It was a lion, and you get eaten. That was a false negative, and because of that kind of safety at hand, not just humans, but I understand a lot of animals are predisposed towards false positives because it's just safer to make, safer to assume you're in danger or that a thing is connected. This is also the thing that makes us good at pattern recognition. But sometimes we're too good at it and we have these false positives. It's just kind of the ramification. And so you see that here, right? Like Joe Rogan's like, well, I had COVID, I took ivermectin, and then I got better. Those must be related. This is also correlation is not the same as causation. But we as individual meat machines are not very good at discerning those causal relations from false positives and causal relations. And this is why science is important because all these studies demonstrate no, ivermectin does not have. You can read right here. Ivermectin had no significant effect on preventing hospitalization of patients with COVID-19 and all the other stuff that was in the previous studies. But like humans are bad at that, and so Joe Rogan's out here being like, ivermectin saved my life. I mean, he didn't literally say that, but just because like we're bad at that kind of discernment, and this is why science is important. And it just does not say the studies built to avoid that exact bias just don't corroborate the claim that ivermectin has any significant impact for treating COVID in any way.
That's why the media had a problem with you, bud. That's why scientists have a problem with you. You cannot say those things and not expect criticism. And Joe did not just take ivermectin. He took a whole cabinet's worth of medicines, including medications that actually had efficacy at the time, like monoclonal antibodies, which, by the way, are super expensive. So, Big Pharma thanks you, Joe, for taking all their medicine.
And there's also studies on people that got administered to the ICU with COVID that somewhere in the it was above 70% were deficient in vitamin D.
Yeah, I think it was over 90%.
Yeah, it's to have a conversation with someone who doesn't take vitamins and is telling you have to take this medication. It's like, this is a crazy conversation.
My friend Dr. Ian Copeland has this analogy about vitamin D and COVID, so I'll use it here. If I show up at a fire and I see smoke and ash on the ground, I might think, wow, all this smoke and ash is causing the fire. If I get rid of the smoke and ash, I'll save the house. It's not how it works. Often
Right,
when you get really sick with something like COVID, your vitamin D levels can drop. That doesn't mean that the low vitamin D levels caused your severe illness. Now it could
This
be
is another correlation causation thing. It's another good example that people often see is like um, every time it rains, the ground is wet. Therefore, the wet ground is causing the rain. Like, no, it's the other way around. Or alternatively, ignoring the common cause, which is closer to this of like, you know, like in that same example with the ground being wet, and also like people are. It's like every time the ground is wet, it's raining, and every time the ground and people are wearing or carrying umbrellas. Therefore, the wet ground is causing the umbrellas or whatever. Like it's like or the umbrellas are causing the wet ground. Either way, no, it's the common cause of the rain. In this case, the common cause of the COVID. I'm struggling to have a
reasonable
good
to ask,
example for that.
what
But
if we restore those vitamin D levels? Does that help? The answer is no. Again, scientists have asked that question and tested it. Treatment of COVID with
And by the
vitamin
way,
D.
the stuff of science. One thing that like in this context, he's right. Like most of these questions have been answered, or at the very least, that questions that you, a layperson, will have are likely to have been answered. But the stuff of science is answering those questions. That's what a scientist does. Is they see that this question exists and they attempt to answer it. In any instance, there's an enormous number of questions that have remained unanswered in science, and a huge number that we don't even know, a huge number of questions we don't even know to ask that are unanswered. Answering those questions is what makes someone is something that a scientist does, and answering certain ones makes someone pretty renowned for them. This is how you get. This is why. This is the exact thing that Einstein was famous for: is answering a question that well, we didn't know to ask, but finding the answer to it, to a question that didn't have a good answer. So it's not that all questions have been asked and we've solved everything, but in this field, the questions that people often ask, most frequently ask, all the ones that come up here have been answered.
Has no effect. It doesn't work as a COVID treatment. So, no, Joe, the answer to infectious disease is not just taking vitamins and living a quote unquote healthy lifestyle, whatever that means. Infectious disease can still take you down.
Yep.
But vaccination is a really good way to reduce the risk of that happening.
You know, there's good evidence that the Spanish flu. There's you know, not a definitive but very strong evidence. The Spanish flu was vaccine-induced flu. The deaths were vaccine-induced.
So this is another thing that I see conspiracy theorists do, is they'll pretend to include nuance for a wild claim so that it looks like they're not being ridiculous, because that claim is so like I think at this point we can dismiss that out of hand of like, obviously that's not true. But he was like, well, it's not conclusive evidence because because now it looks like he is engaging with nuance, but we've seen already he doesn't do that for anything that actually matters, because that this claim doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't matter if that's true for his positions. It would just be like nice for him if people believed him. So he can pretend like to have that nuance, and like if someone's like, "Oh, that's not true," it doesn't really matter that much to him. But the ones that do matter to him, he won't engage with nuance whatsoever. You know.
Oh, wait, you're serious? Let me laugh even harder.
Ooh, what's
What?
the audio in that clip, man?
Oh, what am I listening to? The Spanish flu was vaccine induced?
Like, what does that even mean? Yeah.
God. Flu vaccines weren't even around during the 1918 flu.
Interesting.
Is he saying that
yeah.
smallpox vaccines caused a flu pandemic? I mean, what? What? This is crazy. I don't know. Robert always has a way of surprising me with how wacky he goes.
And this is something that makes it difficult to argue with conspiracy theorists in a face-to-face encounter, even if you're an expert, but especially if you're not, where who could anticipate he would say such a thing? Like, imagine if RFK Jr. was in a conversation with Dr. Wilson here, who clearly knows a lot and is clearly extremely well educated and knows how to engage with this kind of conspiracism. And then he busted out the like Spanish flu line. Like, would Dr. Wilson know the information he would need to debunk that? Maybe not, because like, why would you ever think someone would say that to have the information opposed to it? This is a thing that makes batshit claims always more pervasive than debunks, is that it's impossible to preempt every wacky thing a person could say because of how wacky the things people could say can be. You just can't preempt this kind of thing. You can only react. And it's kind of unfortunate. It's the kind of thing like, and you need, it takes longer often to prove incorrect the wild claim than it takes to say it. It takes, it takes him 10 seconds to say it. I don't know how long it takes to like research and then find the evidence of like, no, that can't possibly be true,
I did not expect this.
Originally, they said it was a flu, but when they've gone back and actually they have all the samples from thousands of people, they died from bacteriological pneumonia.
This part of the podcast was hard to listen to. It was like put a pillow over my face and scream levels of mind numbing. In it, you have two grown men,
that's
the
really saying
biggest
something.
anti-vaxxer in the world and the most listened to podcaster in the world, failing to understand the basic concept that when influenza, the 1918 influenza specifically, was ripping through the population, it was causing pneumonias as a secondary outcome. It does this by attacking the cells in your lungs and respiratory tract and making them more vulnerable to secondary bacterial infection.
This is not uncommon, by the way. This is the kind of thing people should be generally aware of as a thing, especially someone who lived through the Reagan years like RFK had. HIV/AIDS one of the insidious things is because it's an autoimmune disease, is it reduces your ability to fight off other infections. And so often people who have HIV or AIDS will either get sick with or die of other unrelated diseases just because their body is less able to fight off these diseases. As far as I know, that's the only way people die from AIDS. It's not like it's going to kill you in itself, but it's going to make you incapable, or at the very least, significantly less capable of fighting off other diseases. This happens all the time. So it seems like that was a similar thing with the Spanish flu, where, well, maybe it's not even necessarily that. Maybe it was also like as a symptom, but it seems like it in part was just your body was less able to fight off the pneumonia that you were exposed to.
That would normally be kept in check. But because this virus is wreaking havoc on your body and your immune system is overwhelmed with it,
Yeah, there you go.
it can't deal with the normal bacteria. Here are two images of a mouse trachea. On the left is a healthy one. On the right is a trachea that was just ravaged by an influenza virus, with a little white blood cell floating along, far too late to help. This is what the literature means when it says that most of the deaths during the 1918 flu were actually caused ultimately by pneumonia. But the pneumonia would not have happened had the virus not come in and wreaked havoc on the body.
Serologic and histopathologic.
It's kind of like saying, this person didn't die of getting stabbed, they died of blood loss. Like, yes, but one caused the other, right?
Logic results from
And
published
absent the stabbing,
autopsies.
they wouldn't have lost all that blood. In the same way, the people would likely not have contracted, or at the very least died of pneumonia, if not for having having already had the Spanish flu.
Series clearly and consistently implicated secondary bacterial pneumonia caused by common upper respiratory tract bacteria in most influenza fatalities.
Yeah, and some people have suggested that came from getting people to wear masks.
Oh, Jesus.
Oh my god.
Okay, so he didn't even try to defend it. He just said some people have suggested this thing, and of course Joe Rogan believes it. This is another like insidious way that vaccine, like, because now you can't really challenge RFK Jr. like you said that the mask caused this, but because he didn't say that. But that's what the audience heard. That's what his supporters heard, and that's what Joe Rogan took away from it, because they already have their own personal bugbear with masks.
Just gets worse. No, Robert, it was the virus that stripped your body's defenses and made it vulnerable to bacterial infection and subsequent pneumonia. That's why 50 to 100 million people died in the 1918 to 1990 flu pandemic.
And like, think about how wild the world has to be in your brain to be like, vaccines don't prevent disease, but masks cause them. Like, what the hell is happening in your mind?
Because of masks. Jesus Christ.
They had to discredit ivermectin because, because there's a federal law, the emergency use authorization statute says that you cannot issue an emergency use authorization to a vaccine if there is an existing medication that has been approved for any purpose that is demonstrated effective against the target illness. So they had to destroy ivermectin.
So now we're getting to the actual conspiracism. Like, we were more just doing like the typical things conspiracy theorists do, but now we're getting to the actual conspiracism. It's they had to come after ivermectin because it like interfered with their agenda of getting this vaccine out there. Like, now we're getting into the I can't even begin to prove any of this, but this is my way of saying, like, oh, I know there's all that information that says that ivermectin isn't effective whatsoever, but now that's like, they don't want you to know the truth. Now this is where we get to like when Del Bigtree was like, I don't care about the consensus. This is where we're building up to. That's what we're building up to, the ability to dismiss science.
And discredit it, and they had to tell everybody it's not effective, because if they had acknowledged that it's effective in anybody, the whole $200 billion vaccine enterprise would have collapsed.
Yeah, see, there you go.
All right, we're coming out of Kooky Town and back into big old lie town. This is another big lie. No, EUAs are issued in an emergency state. and during the COVID pandemic, there was an emergency state. Let's say ivermectin did work against COVID. In that case, it would have received emergency use authorization for use in COVID patients. The same way there was an emergency use authorization for Pfizer's COVID mRNA vaccine.
And by the way, like, think about the shape of this conspiracy. He thinks that ivermectin was discredited so that they could have the like $200 billion that they get from developing a vaccine that gets issued or whatever else. But like, they had to spend how much money developing this vaccine? Wouldn't it have been so much cheaper if the conspiracy really exists and they're really this money motivated to like do all this stuff? Because remember, this idiot thinks the the that COVID itself was like invented for the benefit of billionaires. But like, okay, they're this motivated to do whatever to like make money. Why not just be like, yeah, ivermectin works, and sell that and make lots and lots of money off of this thing that you don't have to do R&D for. You don't need emergency. You don't need to like jump through all these hoops to get the testing done and done quickly and like deal with all you wacko conspiracists. All you have to you can just go out there and be like, oh yeah, ivermectin, you're right, it does work. You should buy it from us, and then make all that money that way. Why wasn't that like just jack up the prices and then there you go? Why wasn't that what happened? And like, I don't know if he has a good answer for this. They don't ever think about it that way. They never think like why. They never ask themselves, why did the conspiracy I think exists point specifically in the direction it did and not do what was way easier and in agreement with me?
Vaccine, and monoclonal antibodies, and Moderna's mRNA vaccine, and the adenoviral vector-based vaccines, and Paxlovid. You see where I'm going with this? There were multiple EUAs for multiple different drugs issued throughout the pandemic. Some were repurposed drugs, some were new drugs. An EUA for ivermectin against COVID would not have changed subsequent EUAs.
AZT, which was initially a chemotherapy medication that was killing people in a 2-week dose. They were giving them 2 weeks of this stuff was killing people faster than AIDS was killing people.
Yeah.
And they went and took that, faster than cancer was killing people, and they went and took that and started giving it to people that had
too
AIDS.
dangerous for it to treat as a cancer.
Right.
This part of the podcast was one of the most frustrating parts for me to listen to, where they're talking about AZT, otherwise known as zidovudine or retrovir, which is just one antiretroviral medication in a modern antiretroviral cocktail against HIV. This modern cocktail of antiretrovirals turned an HIV diagnosis from a death sentence to a lifelong manageable infection. AZT was a drug that already existed, and it was previously tried as a chemotherapy, a cancer drug, but it didn't work, and there's a reason for that. AZT is a molecule that binds to an enzyme called reverse transcriptase. This is an enzyme necessary for the HIV's life cycle. This enzyme takes RNA and turns it into DNA. Humans don't have this reverse transcriptase, but we do have something called a DNA polymerase.
I'll admit, this is way over
It's
my
an
head, but it's
enzyme
very
that
interesting.
reads DNA and makes copies of it. The enzymes are very different, but similar enough that this drug binds to DNA polymerase as well as reverse transcriptase. It just binds to DNA polymerase a lot less well.
This is another problem that makes it difficult to argue against conspiracy and stuff, is that the information needed to really talk about this is highly technical, and even from someone who's pretty good, like I think Dr. Wilson's very good at making the information accessible to a lay audience. I can't follow a lot of this. This is like way over my head. It's far too technical, and that's really sad, because a lot of people are just going to tune out and just go, well, it's easier to understand the nonsense than the facts, and so they listen to RFK, and it just kind of sucks that things are like that. I mean, maybe if people were better educated generally, that wouldn't be so much the case. And like, I mean, education would be good even if it doesn't have that added benefit. But it just I'm just lamenting like how difficult it is to follow this, and realizing like this is being contrasted by a guy sitting over here be like, no such thing as a good mercury, like, it's just so much harder to understand why these claims are wrong than to just believe the false claims.
Then reverse transcriptase. And this binding a lot less well is why it didn't work as a cancer drug. The idea would be for it to inhibit DNA polymerase so that quickly dividing cells would not survive as well. But it doesn't bind that enzyme super well, so it had to be used in toxically high doses to get any effect. So it didn't work. But with HIV, it binds the reverse transcriptase enzyme a lot better.
Oh, and by the way, like using a drug for something other than its original intent is common, happens all the time. Viagra is a very good example. It was initially intended as like I think it was like a heart attack medication or like blood pressure, something like that. It was like supposed to be for like heart health. Uh, but as it turns out, had a side effect that people found very well appealing. So it gets used differently now. This happens constantly. This is not it's not like malfeasance, though I know a lot of people think it is.
So it could be used at much lower doses effectively against HIV without getting those toxic side effects associated with high doses.
The one question I do have about this is I've seen a decent number of people talking about AZT in the 80s as being extremely toxic and very difficult on them in order to take. Like it wasn't just like, oh, you take it and like it helps manage it. It was like actually pretty rough. And I wonder if there's been like a change to how these things are like what I wonder what bridges those testimonials then. And these aren't coming from people who are like opposed to, these are coming from like activists who are like, we need something better, not saying that it's not saying like we should be, you know, like opposed to the medicine so much as like we need medicine that's less devastating. uh and are because remember, yeah, so like I wonder what bridges like positions then with his position now where it seems like he's like AZT isn't that bad as far as Dr. Wilson is putting it. I'm curious about that.
And AZT works until HIV mutates. That's
Oh, maybe
why
that's the difference.
modern HIV treatments involve a cocktail of antiretrovirals. You see, when there's just one part of the virus being targeted by one molecule, if that part mutates, then the virus is resistant. But if there are multiple drugs targeting multiple parts of the virus, it's a lot harder for one virus to gain enough mutations all at once to resist all of those antiretroviral drugs.
Also, I wonder if RFK was seeing the same kind of things in the Reagan years of people complaining or not complaining, but like activists saying that like AZT was too harsh on them and we needed a better solution, which it seems like this cocktail now that Dr. Wilson describes is that better solution. I wonder if he saw that then and he just hasn't updated his understanding since the 80s, which would make a lot of sense for like how backward his view is.
With modern antiretroviral cocktails, HIV infections can be kept in check for practically a lifetime. And many of those cocktails still include AZT. AZT was the first step towards an antiretroviral treatment against HIV. But Kennedy, in his book, which Rogan apparently loves, claims that
Of course he
AZT is
does.
poison. And he even claims that HIV doesn't cause AIDS in his book.
Wait, what?
It's absolutely wild.
Wait,
I
what?
reviewed the book in full in another video series on my channel. You can go check that out for more details. But I just want to take a moment to tell you how disgusting this is. In Kennedy's book, he mentions a woman named Christine Magyar. In the book, he essentially praises her for her activism as an AZT denier. She denied that AZT was a useful medication against HIV. She thought it was poison. However, Christine herself was HIV positive. So she was denying taking AZT to treat her infection, and she got pregnant, and she had a daughter, and she passed HIV on to her daughter. Fast forward to the early 2000s, and her daughter passes away due to HIV/AIDS complications because she's not allowing her daughter to take what she believes is poison. Not long after her daughter dies, a preventable death, she herself passes away from HIV/AIDS.
And it's this is again what we were talking about, like the real harm that gets done by this kind of medical denialism. It all is. It's one thing. These people always talk about like how like if it's my choice to not take the vaccine, it only affects me. Isn't that okay? But it doesn't, because anti-vaxxers, generally speaking, the biggest impact they have is on their children. The anti-vaxxers have already been vaccinated, usually as children, not for like COVID or whatever, but like most inoculations you get as a child, and these people will refuse to vaccinate their children, and then their children suffer the consequences. I would call that child abuse, child endangerment, negligence. Like I would call like that's really harmful in a real tangible like life or death way, as we see here.
Robert doesn't tell that story in his book, and
Oh, of course not. Yeah.
doesn't mention it here, of course. But that's the reality of what Robert is pushing. He's pushing a world where preventable deaths happen all the time, where mothers who have been brainwashed by fear are putting children that they love in positions where they are going to die preventable deaths. It's sick, it's twisted, and it is absolutely maddening that those messages are being pushed by the host of the most listened to podcast in the world.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
It's disgusting, and I
Yeah.
hope people see it for what it is.
Yep.
Whew, okay, let's move on to the rest of the video. We're almost done.
But anyway, they gave us the 6 months of data for the two designated groups, and it's an alarming result because there were 4 people who died of 4 to 5 people who died of cardiac arrest in the vaccine group, and only 1 in the placebo group. What that means is if you take the vaccine, you're 21% more likely to die over 6 months, according to this data, which is not good data and not enough of a big group,
Almost
of a
certainly
large enough
not
group
true.
to really make these kind of predictions. But it's all they gave us, so they're stuck with this number.
Okay, so here he's talking about the randomized clinical trials for Pfizer's COVID vaccine, which conveniently was a saline placebo-controlled trial, something he denies ever happens. Cool. But he's complaining about it because he says that there were more cardiac deaths in the vaccine group than the placebo group. He completely fails to mention that this was a non-significant result. It was 4 deaths versus 1 death. The clinical trial was not powered to statistically measure differences in those kinds of outcomes. Its only purpose was to measure whether or not COVID vaccines prevented symptomatic infection. And they did. Not only that, but it's not all we have, as he implies. There are mountains of pharmacovigilance data surrounding Pfizer's vaccine, Moderna's vaccine, and all the other COVID vaccines. This pharmacovigilance data involves several different reporting databases and health agencies all across the world actively investigating the ongoing safety of these vaccines in the population.
Honestly, I would argue that saying things like RFK just did, where he was saying like 4 people died of cardiac arrest or whatever, I would argue that he is incentivizing anecdotal approaches to this thing, because every single anti-vax person I've ever come across has the one story of the one person they know that got a vaccine and then later a thing happened to them, and obviously isn't it that thing? But this is again a false positive. Additionally, it's often the people who say this have no way of connecting, like no reason to believe they're related whatsoever, like that one caused the other. But it doesn't matter. You have people like this encouraging you to say, look, 4 people died. Doesn't that mean it's dangerous? Well, if 4 people died, let's assume he's even correct that 4 people died after getting the vaccine and it was caused by the vaccine. We don't know that, but let's assume he's right. Okay, but how many people took the vaccine? Right? Like we don't know. Like he's not giving us that kind of information. We don't know for the study or whatever. But like, if 1%, or like, sorry, I saw the number 1% on the screen. That's why I said it. But no, like let's say those 4 people died, but it was in a study of 5,000 people. It's bad that those people died, but like that's like we have to compare that to what's being prevented. We also have to consider, is that likely to be caused by that? This is something he's talking about, like what is statistically significant and whether the study was even able to determine that. That's what Dr. Wilson was just talking about. Like even if it's true that the what he's talking about, it doesn't prove anything, except it does to the people who are thinking anecdotally. And I think I don't know if it's intentional or not, but he seems to be pointing people in that direction. He seems to be encouraging an anecdotal approach of like, I know a person who a thing happened to them after the, and it must be related. And it's like, well, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But the one person that had a thing happen to them weighed against thousands of people who died to COVID. Like it sucks and it feels worse, right? This is in a sense trolley problem stuff. Uh, Something often considered like basic ethics of, and it feels like, I don't know, it feels cruel to say like, oh, we should, like, one person should die. Like they haven't even demonstrated the link. I want to remind everyone, but it's people to say that harm needs to be avoided at all costs is to say I'd rather throw millions of or thousands or millions of people under the bus than this handful, and that seems so much worse.
You can read several of these publications that show the results of these investigations for free, and all of them show that COVID vaccines are extremely safe. What do I mean when I say that they're extremely safe? Do I mean 100% safe, never cause harm, never cause a death? No, I don't mean that, because that's an unrealistic bar for a medication to reach.
Yep.
Every single medical intervention, every single action you do, every single choice you make has risk.
Yeah.
Nothing is 100% safe.
Even as a minimum, like sometimes a person can be allergic to one of the ingredients. That's bad, but like you can be allergic to lots of stuff. Like some people are allergic to peanuts. Do we like disallow peanuts from being existent? Now, anti-vaxxers would be like, therefore there shouldn't be a mandate. Well, there isn't, but also people who are allergic are definitely not required to get it. Nothing is 100%, but we're not weighing doing this versus nothing. We're weighing it versus an unvaccinated population wherein what was the number we found? Something like was it like 250,000 people died already in the U.S. just in the U.S. Like that's what we're weighing it against. I think it was more than that, but I don't remember the number.
The question is vaccination safer than not vaccinating?
Did I say 250,000? I
And
think
the
I meant
answer is that
yes,
yes,
250,000,000.
vaccination
No, yeah,
is
250,000,000,
much
yeah.
safer than
Yeah,
not
250,000,000.
vaccinating.
But in 1976, when they had this,
Excuse me, yeah,
really
I was
bad
being
flu
very silly.
shot, that they did the same thing with. They did it, global rollout, and everybody had to take it. And they pulled the shot after 25 deaths reported. 25.
I've heard some other conspiracy theorists make this similar claim before, and it's extremely misleading. In 1976,
And
there
I'd like to
were
point out anytime someone like this, and by like this I mean RFK, notice every time he says they. Because often when he says they, he's referring nebulously to like the 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 like the cabal of his conspiracy, whereas people who aren't conspiracists tend not to do that very much.
no confirmed deaths attributed to that influenza vaccine rollout. What actually happened in 1976 was there was a prediction that the flu strain circulating that year would be really bad. And so there was a large push to vaccinate people before flu season started. It turned out that the flu, for whatever reason, just wasn't that deadly that year. The predictions were wrong. And so the vaccination campaign stopped because it wasn't needed, not because the vaccines weren't safe.
Another
That's the
instance of
real
him
story
lying.
there. You can read more about it in the description. But Kennedy is not telling it accurately. He's being dishonest.
But also, you need to get rid of these really corrupting financial entanglements between the pharmaceutical industry and the regulatory agencies that has put agency capture on steroids. For example, almost 50% of FDA's budget comes from pharmaceutical companies.
Nope, that's not true.
Oh,
What
look.
really
oh,
happens is whenever a pharmaceutical company submits material to the FDA, whether it's a biological licensure agreement or a new drug application, they have to pay fees. And these fees for their submission come out of pocket. They're quite expensive, actually. And those fees fund the work that the government does in that area. So really, it's one less thing that taxpayers have to fund. In reality, pharma would rather not pay millions of dollars out of pocket just to submit applications to the FDA that are most likely going to fail. I mean, really, that's the reality here. A whopping 80% of new drug applications fail.
And I want to like take a moment to say like try to imagine what the world would look like if it if what he was implying he wanted done happened, right? He's complaining that so much money is going to the FDA through these pharmaceutical companies. So what would the world look like if it wasn't like that? Well, as we just learned, those are coming through fees for these applications. So now you would want it to not be funded by these fees. So now either the FDA is underfunded or that has to come from the taxpayer. Is that better? No, it seems much worse. And especially since so many of these drug reviews fail, so many of these drugs are not approved. If they're underfunded, more unsafe drugs would be getting through, or fewer safe drugs would be getting approval because they wouldn't be able to get through the glut of applications. The world just gets so much worse if what he wants happens.
Not exactly a rubber stamp pipeline, is it? So the question for anyone out there who thinks that there are huge conflicts of interest here, why is that new drug application approval number so low? Wouldn't you expect it to be higher in a world where pharma is just getting anything by because they pay for it?
This is my point that I asked him what does. And he said there's a few, there's environmental factors they're aware of. I go, what are those? And he couldn't cite them.
Yeah.
Like, how can you be so sure?
Wait, you're complaining about citations? The guy across from you has been spouting off nonsense, and you haven't cared about a single citation, all of which would have demonstrated he was wrong. Now you care. This is another thing of like, what citations do you care about? Only the ones that are in opposition to you, not the ones that support what you're talking about. Like that support the nonsense. Like that's pretty telling.
To say this definitely doesn't, but you're telling me there's a bunch of environmental factors that do cause it, and we're aware of those factors, but you're not aware of them, and you're an expert in this?
Yeah.
How is that possible?
If Joe took a moment to actually read about what we know about what causes autism, he would find that the real answer is it's complicated. There are known genetic factors that can influence whether or not someone is on the autism spectrum. There are also known environmental factors, such as air pollution, that can influence an autism outcome. The mechanistic link between these factors and autism is not well understood or nailed down. Science is still working on that. People are still asking questions and looking for answers. But we do know enough about autism to know that it most likely starts in utero. In utero, when your nervous system develops, your body prunes the synapses on your neurons. And it is thought that in people who have autism, this pruning doesn't happen as much as other people, which contributes to their sensory overload. But when it comes to things like vaccines, we can directly test whether or not they increase the risk
really
of autism. That testing has been done countless times, and every time there is no link. Just because we don't understand something completely doesn't mean we can rule things out when it comes to what causes it. But if Joe Rogan wants to ignore the wealth of scientific knowledge built around this topic over several generations and plant himself firmly in the vaccines cause autism camp of the early 2000s, right next to Jenny McCarthy and Andrew Wakefield, then he can dig that hole himself.
But the fact that no one will debate you speaks volumes, especially now. They can't
Oh
say
God,
now that
this is
you're
what I mean about like when you don't when cranks aren't confronted, it doesn't look like it's not that suddenly no one's platforming them. They still get platforms, but now they act like no one will address their ideas. People do constantly, but then dipshits like Joe Rogan are out here being like, "Oh, it must be in you're right because no one will debate you." Well, sometimes people don't debate you because what you're saying is so ridiculous or so odious. Like there are lots of there are there are lots like if I went out here and I was just like, listen, man, sky is green, debate me, and no one debated me, that wouldn't be because I'm right. It's because what I'm saying is so absurd that it's not worth debating.
not popular.
No one
But
is
that said, this is also like part of a problem of like perception. This is why you need people to debate cranks who are able to, and it's a small subsect. Most people that we've seen, almost everyone that we've seen on my stream would not be good to put in a debate with RFK Jr. It would be kind of disastrous. Dr. Wilson might do a good job. I don't know how he is in debate settings, but he seems to know what he's talking about, and he's so far been the only person that we've encountered that would be up to snuff for even knowing what he would need to know to debate him. I don't imagine that RFK Jr. would take him up on that, even if he wanted to, for what it's worth.
Is obligated to debate RFK Jr.
Yeah. Also, yeah, no
RFK
one's
Jr.
obligated to.
knows nothing about science. He knows nothing about vaccines or
And in some ways, it's legitimizing to have someone who actually knows what they're talking about argue with someone like this. The problem is they go on instead they go on Joe Rogan and act like they're so correct that people won't argue with them.
or medicine. These debates have already happened in the scientific literature, at conferences,
Yep.
in
It's
lab
happening
meetings,
here in this video.
at the water cooler in scientific institutions. These debates have happened, the literature is out there, and it's over. Vaccines don't cause autism. Vaccines aren't responsible for chronic conditions. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been pushing these long debunked ideas for decades, and he got a huge lucky break when Joe Rogan was gullible enough to have him on his show and indulge every wacky idea he has. Whether or not a debate between some scientist and RFK Jr. happens on Rogan's podcast, and no matter the outcome, it's not going to change the evidence. Dangling money for scientists to come dance like a puppet for him on his podcast and debate a quack who has absolutely no idea what he is talking about and has been pushing genuinely harmful, science-denying ideas for decades is just such a sad state for the most listened to podcast in the world.
Yep.
Disinformation around vaccines is not going away. It's going to get recycled over and over again. But each time it gets recycled, you can be better prepared. Hopefully, I have helped you do that in this video.
I think yeah.
Again,
Thank you.
all of the links to all of the science that I talk about are in the description below. And with that, I think I'm going to end this video here. Thank you very much for watching if you made it this far. I really do appreciate it. I'm just a regular scientist making these videos in my free time. So if you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribed. And you can join me next time, where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.
Oh, this was only from 4 days ago. I didn't even realize. Yeah, that was a really interesting video. I am incredibly glad that we went through that interview with the lens of Dr. Wilson, who was able to inform us. There was so much stuff that I wouldn't have even been able to guess at, and that's why I wanted to do it in that way. You can see the value. Like, yeah, you can see a lot of the dishonesty without that expertise, but it would have been significantly less comprehensive. So I'm really glad we watched it in that way. Yeah, it seems pretty clear that RFK Jr. is incredibly dishonest, as we saw with Del Bigtree, in a different way. He's less performative, but that might also just be from context. I guess he's more performative in the sense that like he's running for political office and whatever else. But he didn't have that like vein busting out of his head like Del Bigtree had when he was going off at Neil deGrasse Tyson. But he was also in a conversation with someone who generally agrees with him, so who is usually on board for medical misinformation. So I'm glad we had the context of Dr. Wilson to explain, like, to catch these lies that I would never have caught. And it's okay and important, in fact, to do that, to look for experts who know what they're talking about, who are citing not their own opinions but consensus, to evaluate claims like this. So I'm really glad we did. I think tomorrow I want to get back to debate review stuff. I'm really hoping that Dr. Wilson would be willing to come on. If not, I completely understand, right? Like, I'm a tiny channel at the moment. Hopefully that changes going forward. Like, comment, subscribe. But I think tomorrow we'll do some debate review stuff, and we'll go from there. I'm really glad we watched this video. I hope that satisfies the requests I got for watching both the Del Bigtree and Neil deGrasse Tyson interview, and also Joe Rogan or RFK Jr. on Joe Rogan. I know that we didn't watch the whole interview, and we said watch reaction video, but I think that was more valuable, honestly, than if we had watched the interview because, well, one, I mean, it took us 2 hours to go through a 15-minute video. That's just how long it takes. I'm noticing it's about like 2 to 1 for runtime to how long it takes to. Maybe we'll get better about that in the future. But in any case, the actual interview was probably like an hour and a half or something. We've been at this forever, and I wouldn't have caught everything. It would have been pretty boring. So I'm glad we got the additional information here, and I don't really have much else to go on about. I guess I will. I'm glad to be back, and we'll have some more tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. Have a good day. Catch you next time. Bye.